Hello, and welcome to the Raven and the Writing Desk. I am your host, Chris Lester, the creator and head author of the Metamor City podcast and story fiction universe. I am here in the virtual studio with author and podcaster Scott Roche.
Hey, Chris.
How's it going today, Scott?
Good. How are you?
Doing pretty well. I exploded a spaghetti squash today, but apart from that, things are going... The wonders of Facebook. So we are here today because Scott is the author of a new book called Coming Home Again, which is being released on August 31st by Iron Kilt Productions. Scott, why don't you start out by telling us a bit about what this book is about?
Well, this book is, it fits in a couple of genres. It's a science fiction story, but it's also a romance. Happens to be, the romance aspect happens to be a male-male romance. It's basically about the main character is a doctor and a psychiatrist who works for a top secret military installation. Think, Hangar 13 kind of, Grooms Lake kind of thing. And he is brought in by a man from Homeland Security to talk to somebody who claims to be an alien or who claims to be an alien abductee to find out if he is who he says he is. And in the process, the two end up falling for each other and hijinks ensue, as they say.
Now, this is not your first fiction rodeo. You wrote and produced the podcast Archangel. You wrote Two Steps from Hell, House of Phobos, The Casebook of Esho St. Clair. You've had your short fiction In the Way of the Gun, Dirty Magic New Orleans, Tales from the Archives. So what is it about this book that makes it a step outside your comfort zone?
Well, I guess there are a couple of aspects that make this outside of my usual oeuvre. First, it's a romance, and this is my first time writing a romance. I have written some erotica before, but that's a different kettle of fish, even though they're at least within kissing distance, I think would be the most appropriate analogy. And it's got the homosexual aspect to it too, which is this is the first time I've written a story where the protagonist is gay, so that is also a different thing that I'm used to. So both of those aspects are new to me in terms of writing.
And what was it that inspired you to go down this route?
Well, oddly enough, I found this really interesting market and called Glittership, which is a short fiction podcast, and they're a paying market, and they require their stories to have at least one character, preferably the protagonist, who is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer. And I went through my stories thinking, okay, I should have one of those or an idea or something. But sure enough, I didn't. So at least not that was in the science fiction genre anyway, which is I think that's their primary genre they're looking for is science fiction. And so I sat down and came up with this idea, and initially it was from the point of view of the abductee, and so I sent it out to some beta readers. It was about 6,500 words, and everybody that read it said there's more story here than you're giving it room for, because I gave them all the direction of finding places to cut because it was a little over the Glittership's limit, and they all said don't cut it, add to it. And so it became a novella. And actually one of the beta readers said it would be really interesting if you wrote it from the doctor's point of view. So in the process of writing it from the doctor's point of view and adding to it, pretty soon it became an almost 19,000 word novella.
Cool. And what sort of prep work? This is your first romance, you said. So what did you do in order to prepare for that? Because I understand that the romance genre has some pretty rigid, like, structural rules for it.
Yeah, I actually, completely unrelated to this, over the last year, I have been reading and listening to more romances. There's a series. I forget the name of the location, but it's Jane Jameson is the protagonist, and it takes place in Kentucky, and it's a urban fantasy romance series. The first one is called "Nice Girls Don't Have Fangs." It's hilarious. It's got a great sense of humor, strong romance elements, and also it's got some fantasy elements. And I highly recommend it to any of your listeners. But anyway, so I've listened to 3 or 4 books in that series, and I also have, as part of the Dead Robot Society, we did and have done and are continuing to do book review shows, and we did a romance for a recent show, and so that helped. So yeah, I've been broadening my reading horizons as well lately. So I was prepared to tackle the genre thanks to that. And I think there are strong romantic elements in some of the podcast fiction that I've listened to over the years, and other fiction that I've read and listened to over the years. While they weren't strictly speaking romances, at least I had some of the tools in the box, even though I didn't realize it when I first started writing this.
And did you do any specific research with regard to the gay relationship aspect of it?
I didn't. I kind of relied on, again, I have read a fair amount of fiction that have gay characters or transgender characters. I've actually written a couple of transgender characters, but I knew that I had a lot of resources that I could pull from in the process of writing it to make sure that I was doing right by that community. So, and also I am a bisexual. So while of course that's not the same thing, at least it gave me some a feel for how to write a character who's attracted to men.
Mm-hmm. And so you had beta readers who you ran this by to make sure that it was true to life?
Yes, I have a couple friends in that community, and they read it, and I have a couple friends who read a lot of male romance, and they read it and gave me good feedback. And so far, all the feedback has been really positive. So, I did have to tweak some things. I did get some things wrong. So it was nice to have one of the advantages I have as a writer in social media is I have a pretty diverse group of friends that help me with stuff like this. So never underestimate the value of a diverse group of beta readers.
Amen. Why do you think it's important for writers to write outside their comfort zones? If you've got a formula that's working for you, why mess with it?
Well, one of the romances that I read is actually a really good example of why it's a good idea to do it. The author is a fairly well-known person in the romance genre. I'm blanking utterly on her name. But anyway, the story that we read was a psychological thriller / romance. And the author got a lot of the psychological thriller aspects not wrong, really, but they were very diluted. And I think that if she had written more in that genre or done more research in that genre, that maybe it would have been a stronger book. And so I think that it's important for writers to try new things, try different things. I think it'll make you a better writer overall. And personally, I never want to be, I was just telling my wife this the other night, I never want to be pigeonholed into one genre or one type of book. I want to be more like Stephen King, where even though in general he's well known for his horror, if you really look at his body of work, he has written in several genres. science fiction, fantasy, obviously horror, psychological thrillers. There are romantic elements in some of his books. So, yeah, I want to write as broadly as I read, and I think that any author should. You should be reading outside. You should be reading outside your comfort zone, and that's going to make you a better writer because you never know when you're going to get an idea that won't work in the genre that you typically work in, and it'll also give you a bigger toolbox because even if you don't write romances, odds are pretty good you're going to have characters that are in love and have romantic relationships, and you'll want to be able to pull the ability to write a romantic scene or a romantic subplot into your otherwise, perfectly average science fiction novel.
To that point, where do you go when you're looking for writing that you know or hope is going to challenge you as a reader?
So how do I think about what I'm going to write next? That kind of thing?
No, like you said that it's important to read outside your comfort zone and to challenge yourself as a reader in order to give yourself sort of grist for the mill as a writer. So where do you go when you're looking to be challenged as a reader?
Oh, gotcha. Well, it gets back to swimming in a pretty diverse social media sea. I have a lot of people with very diverse tastes, and sometimes if I see a book come up in my feed or like on Goodreads or some other social media group that I'm part of, and I say, that really doesn't look like that's my cup of tea. Sometimes I take that as an impetus to read it anyway, And I've got a lot of writer friends that write in a variety of genres, and even if I think their book may not quite be something I'd enjoy, I may snap up the sample anyway and see if it's something that clicks with me. So, yeah, I think that's good. And also, having participated in review groups and book clubs and that kind of thing, a lot of times I'll end up reading something that I would not have otherwise chosen for myself. It's tempting to kind of stay in your comfort zone in terms of what you read or what you watch on TV. I also find that consuming TV shows and movies, a lot of times, like I have Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Plus, and a lot of times I'll pick an episode of something that I might not ordinarily watch and just watch it and see if it's something that I enjoy. So yeah, it's really just keeping your options open and making sure that you don't say no as a knee-jerk reaction. I don't watch, chick flicks or romantic comedies or gory horror movies or whatever, why not? I mean, give it a shot. Maybe just the ones that you saw weren't a good example or a well-done example.
What's the book or story that you consumed in the last year that has surprised you the most with how much you enjoyed it?
That's a good question. I would almost have to go back to the book series that I was talking about earlier. It really, the Jane Jameson series, it was given to me by a friend. The first book was given to me by a friend, and she was like, I don't know if this is something you'll enjoy, but here. So I went into it knowing that it was a romance and knowing that it had urban fantasy elements to it, horror elements to it. I did not expect to like the romantic elements as much as I did. I think part of the reason I enjoyed them so much was because all of the other elements, the comedy and the other plot points that it had, were so challenging and interesting that the romance was just an extra, a little bit of spice to that whole picture.
And in writing this book, what was the hardest moment that you had where you were really struggling to push through a challenging point in the narrative, and how did you get yourself through it?
Let's see. The most challenging thing actually turned out not to be so much the romance or the science fiction element of it, But there's a protagonist in this book that it was very tempting to make him just a scene chewing bad guy, two-dimensional, and two-dimensional villain.
An antagonist?
Yeah. I said protagonist, but so the antagonist is some of the feedbacks that I got from my beta readers was he needed to be more a fully fleshed out person. And so getting him to be that fully fleshed out person, examining his reasons for doing what he does, and making him, if not more sympathetic, at least less cardboard cutout bad guy, was a very challenging piece to this story.
And how did you get through that?
Well, a lot of it was, one, becoming aware of the fact that was an issue, which my beta readers helped me out with that. And two, it was just, I just had to add some more scenes with him and have him figure out a way to have him explain why he was doing what he was doing. So that had to be done. One of the interesting things that happened also in the process of rewriting after this went through with my beta readers, you know how you're writing a story and you'll have a secondary character that you didn't plan on, and they become really interesting to you and to your readers. A couple of readers picked out the secondary character that I had and said, she needs more screen time. And so that was one of the things that I enjoyed about expanding this out to a novella, was I got an opportunity to have a couple of scenes with her and have a couple of scenes with the antagonist. And I got to flesh out the romance a little bit more. So that's the other thing that was initially a challenge, because I was envisioning this as a short story. I constrained myself to that initial length of a maximum of 6,500 words. And that was trying to get it under that was a challenge, but then allowing myself to go, okay, this isn't a short story. This is obviously something more, and allowing myself to write the scenes that needed to be written. So that was a lot of fun. That was a good part of the process. And also deciding what scenes needed to stay in and in what scenes to expand, because I could have spent, I probably could have written another 5,000-10,000 words on this, but I would have felt like I was padding it out. So it's always a challenge to know what scenes are important, what scenes aren't. And I've always been kind of a writer. I'll write, my first draft will typically be very bare bones, and then I'll build out, whereas I know a lot of writers overwrite and cut back. So that's always a challenge, to know where to add, where to cut back, and what needs to make it to the final product.
As I forget who said this originally, but it's the difference between cutter outers and adder inners. They're like the two main categories of writers. Yes.
Yeah, I tend to be very much an adder inner. In fact, the thing I'm working on right now, I know as I'm writing it, I need to flesh this out. I need to expand on that. But I'm like, no, this is the first draft. I just need to get to the end, finish it, and then go back and flesh things out and make the descriptions better and really put some meat on the skeleton that I have put together. Because the problem I have when I'm writing something a lot of times is I'll go down rabbit trails, especially if I don't have an outline. I'll go down rabbit trails and I'll write things that just don't really add any value to the story. So yeah, that's another part of my process that I'm working on, is staying focused and knowing that I don't have to get everything right the first time. Keep moving forward.
I'd like to open up an opportunity now for our live viewers to post their questions. So if you are watching this on Google Hangouts on air, If you move your mouse over to the left side of your window, you will see a pop-up with a series of commands, and one of the areas that you can open up is a little voice box icon that says Q&A on it. So if you click on that, you will be taken to the Q&A section on the right side of your screen, where you can enter questions for me and Scott, and we can then answer those. So if you have questions, if you're watching, you have something you'd like to ask me or Scott about the book or about writing outside your comfort zone, go ahead and post those up there and we will answer them. I have a little pop-up from Chris Moody asking Nora Roberts.
Yes, that was it, Nora Roberts. It was one of her more recent books. That was like I said, a psychological thriller. There was a serial killer, and it was actually, I really enjoyed it. I would probably read it again. I think overall, we did it for Dead Robots, and Paul and Terry and I both felt that it could be stronger in a number of areas. But as a romance, it did what it needed to do, you know. And one of those things, in this particular story, I guess this was also a challenge that I didn't really think about. Romances, one of the tropes in romances is you've got to have a happy ending.
Right.
And so it's no spoiler to say this has a happy ending. But happy endings don't always mean everything works out, obviously. And I tend to like my endings to be a little more, what's the word? I guess the victories in my books can often be a little bit more pyrrhic. And I do like to write things that have some darker aspects. But, you know, that's something I had to set aside for this and be true, because I want people who read this, who are expecting a romance, to get what they expect, at least in terms of these general tropes of the genre.
Indeed. You want to challenge your readers, but you can't break faith with them. And there are certain things, depending upon genre, that are implicit in being part of that genre. And in a romance, having a happy ending for your couple is key.
Yeah. And I also...
Scott, we lost your audio there. You may want to check your connections.
Is that better?
Yes, that's much better.
Okay. So, as I was saying, this is as much a science fiction book in my mind as it is a romance. And
sure that the science fiction elements were as strong as the romance elements, and that science fiction fans would enjoy this as much as romance fans. So obviously I'll have to wait to hear back from the readers if I succeeded in that, because one of the things I love to do as a writer, and this is another area of sort of getting out of your comfort zone a little bit, is I love to mash up genres. You know, and
We lost you again there, Scott. Waiting for Scott to get his audio back. Please stand by. How's it going there, Scott? He is troubleshooting. For those of you who are just joining us, I am here with author Scott Roche talking about writing outside your comfort zone and the new novel or novella that he has just written called Coming Home Again. It will be out in Amazon in ebook on August 31st. and we are currently taking questions from the audience. So if you've got questions, you can go ahead and navigate over to the left side of your screen if you're watching us through Google Hangouts on air, and you can post a question by clicking on the little Q&A box, and that will open up the Q&A sidebar where you can ask a question, which we can then answer as soon as we get Scott's audio back. So while we're waiting, I will go ahead and tackle this question from Chris Moody. He says, for either of you, if you do Patreon, is it difficult to come up with a story every month? Yes, Chris, it is. This is something that I have been struggling with. When I started my Patreon campaign at the beginning of the year, I was pushing pretty hard to get new material out. I had a little bit of a backlog of stories that were waiting to be released, and some stories that I could finish up fairly quickly. So I had some content there for a while that I was able to go ahead and put out faster than I was writing it, particularly since I was also working on the Lost and the Least during the same time. So my new writing was going into the new novel rather than into new short stories. And so keeping up and providing consistent rewards for my Patreon patrons was a challenge, and that is something that I am currently working on, figuring out how to navigate. Is it more important to put out new bonus stories, to write new short stories for the Patreon feed, or is it more important to make sure that the next novel is ready when Things Unseen ends at the end of this year? So I have my feelings about that. There may be differences of opinion among my subscribers, but so far my patrons have been pretty supportive of the fact that, the podcast comes first. That's what we're paying to support. And, bonus content is a bonus. And maybe, focus on providing us with bonus content that isn't necessarily meaning extra work for you. So I've been working on providing bonus artwork for my patrons. It's a big part of my thank you to them. That's where I'm at. Scott, do we have you back now? I see your face there in the corner again.
Am I audible?
Yay, you're audible.
Yay!
Hey, you want to tackle this question? If you do you do Patreon, first of all?
I do indeed.
And do you find it difficult to come up with the bonus content for your subscribers?
Well, the way I do it, I've changed how I do it a little differently. I used to do it per piece, I guess, and I switched to a per month model a few months ago. And so basically what I do for my patrons, one of the things I do is I provide them every month with a sneak peek to what I'm working on presently. So my non-supporting public readers on Patreon, I don't know what you'd call those folks, soon to be patrons, hopefully, are treated to sort of progress updates, whereas my patrons get the actual words, and then a lot of times they'll also get, like, depending on what their support level is, when I come out with something, they'll get it either for free or at a reduced cost when I actually put something out. So bonus content tends to be work in progress kind of stuff.
Cool. Question from Noble Bear, who says, when considering pushing one's boundaries, would either of you differentiate between genre and type of story in the genre? Examples: cyberpunk romance, Victorian comedy. I think that there is sense of there are different kinds of major plots that you can have within the confines of genre. So within science fiction, you could have a romance, or you could have a caper, or you can have a farce, or you can have a family drama. And all of these are science fiction because of the milieu in which they take place, and in because of the, hopefully, the science fiction elements being important to the resolution of the plot. So I think that those things, the things you're talking about, can definitely happen. But romance, capital R romance, is also its own genre. You can have romances in other kinds of stories, but for it to be a capital R romance, there's a particular structure to that. There are particular constraints. It's like writing a sonnet. There are rules that you have to follow. And, you know, if you follow those rules, if you follow that format, then you have a capital R romance. But you can have romantic storylines in other kinds of genres that don't necessarily adhere to the rules of the capital R romance story form.
Yeah. I'll say, and I don't know if this is exactly what he means, but I'll give an example. There are a couple of things that I'm reading right now that tend to play with genre in a way that I would not have thought of. There's a series called The Genre Knots by Michael Underwood, I think. And it is a science fiction story. It is a science fiction series in its arc, but because of the nature of each individual story, he spends a lot of time in other genres, and that's a genre mashup, and it works pretty well. So I could see in the same story, like in this story that I'm putting out next week, it has capital R romance aspects to it, but it also has the science fiction elements, which are not a set dressing. The conflicts that arise are handled using science fiction elements, but there's also the conflict that is generated in a romance. So I think there's room for both, and more than just genre mashups, but books that might fall in multiple genres, depending on the nature of the story. But I definitely like the idea of pushing myself by combining elements that might not be traditional to a particular genre. So to Chris's example of a sonnet, yes, you have to, if you're writing a sonnet, you have to obey certain rules, but that doesn't mean that you can't also incorporate other poetic elements in the sonnet. And some genres have stricter guidelines or expectations or tropes than others, certainly. So a true capital R romance horror blend would be challenging because a happy ending thing we were talking about earlier, it can be hard to pull that off, but I'm not saying that it's not possible.
Yeah, I would suspect you'd end up with something like Warm Bodies.
Right. Yeah, so I mean, it's, so then you ask yourself, how do you market something like that? And
that's the tricky part.
Yeah. So my hope is that, like I said, with this particular piece, if you're going in expecting a romance, you'll get what you expected, and that if you're going in also expecting a science fiction story, that you'll be satisfied with that aspect of it as well. But I think of like a lot of Paul Cooley's stories. He's got a series where he's got elements of horror and elements of romance, but I wouldn't call it a romance because he doesn't believe in happy endings,
right?
As he said. So yeah, but it's still, the romantic aspect of it is still a major part of it, and it's still satisfying. But yeah, don't go in expecting Harlequin, definitely.
I remember when I was talking to Gail Carriger about her writing the book Soulless, she went and broke down a whole bunch of uh, different romance novels in terms of where do the major plot points happen, and she could nail it down to specific page numbers. Like on page such and such, the hero and the heroine meet for the first time. Page such and such, you have their first kiss. On page such and such, you have the argument that drives them apart, etc., etc. And
Yeah.
she used those story beats in writing Soulless.
Yeah, that's some science right there. I mean, that doesn't surprise me that that it is that rigid. It's more like a sonnet or like a haiku. You've got to hit the beats in the right place at the right time. It remains to be seen whether I was successful there. But then this is a novella, so it's got a lot more. It's more compressed in terms of both the time that the story happens in and the space that I have in terms of the words. And really what this is too, this story is a way of me floating a balloon and saying, okay, is this good? Do people like these characters? And if the answer to those things is yes, then I will write potentially a full-length novel with these characters and their further adventures. So I tend to use short stories and novellas as kind of test balloons to see if I'm hitting the right notes, and if they sell and if people enjoy them, then I'll put some more time into that particular series or story idea or story universe.
I suspected something like that was going on with Two Steps from Hell. It very much had that feeling of a pilot episode in a series.
Yes, and I actually do have in process. I do have the next story with those characters because I really like those characters. It's a question of I want to work more in that world, but it didn't really do gangbusters sales wise, and people aren't just clamoring for it. So if you're listening and you really like that story, let me know, and I'll move it up the priority chain.
That's a good segue. What else are you working on right now?
Well, and in that note, actually, what I'm working on right now is an Echo St. Clair story, because I got a lot of positive feedback from the. Basically, what I did was I took two novelettes, I guess, and put them into one ebook package, and that's the Casebook of Echo St. Clair. I am writing at this point. It feels like the first draft is going to be about 45 or 50,000 words. So I imagine that when it is done, it'll probably be closer to 80,000. So basically what I'm working on right now is the first Echo St. Clair full-length novel. And I feel like I'm at about the 75% mark with it. So it is for those people who are not familiar with it. The phrase that I've loved most is gaslight fantasy. It's not steampunk because it doesn't have the technological elements. It's not urban fantasy because it's in a Victorian setting. And so I after doing some noodling around online, I found out there is in fact a term for it, for Victorian fantasy essentially. It's called gaslight fantasy, and so that's what I have started calling it. Basically, it's the main character is a detective who has some magical abilities. Think Jim Butcher's Dresden Files. The protagonist is an African-American former Pinkerton, who has started his own private detective business, and he investigates supernatural crimes and cases. And so in the first two stories that are out there, in one story it's very Lovecraftian. He deals with a client who has been cursed and is turning into this sort of Cthulhu creature, and he has to find out who's cursed him and why, and try and find a cure if he can. And the other one is very much, it's a little steampunkier because there are technology elements to it. And Nikola Tesla is a character in that story, and he is he's hiring Esho St. Clair to verify that he is in, because in this story, Tesla believes he has found a technology to capture a ghost on film, and he wants Esho to verify that's indeed what happened. And in the process, they discover that it is actually something that Thomas Edison has Thomas Edison has stepped in and messed around with his stuff. And anyway, so it's got a bit more of a steampunk feel to it. Well, what I'm writing right now has got kind of a horror feel to it. Esho is hired by a local house of ill repute to investigate some murders that are happening. There are prostitutes that are being killed, very a la Jack the Ripper. And so he has to find who's killing these ladies and why, because the police aren't looking into it, as prostitutes aren't real high on their priority list. So it's got elements of fantasy, it's got elements of horror, it's got elements of a detective novel. If you like Sherlock Holmes, if you like Jim Butcher's Dresden Files, if you like steampunk, and if any of that appeals to you, then check out the first couple of stories and be looking out for this to come out. I'm shooting to have the novel done sometime in September, and then I'll have it out to beta readers in September, October. So I'd like to have it ready to ship at the end of the year.
Right on. Got another question from Noble Bear here. He says, how does the length of the story impact how you approach genre or limit your ability to explore new things?
That's a good question. I mean, the length of the story, I don't know that genre has a whole lot to do with it, but obviously, if you set out with a specific length in mind, it's definitely going to impact things like where the story beats happen, and if you can fully examine or flesh out some elements that might be common to that genre. Like, for example, I think it would be really hard to do a true space opera short story or a true bit of military sci-fi in a small package, because those genres tend to, or epic fantasy, those genres tend to like a lot of room to work.
I think what you'd have to do is you'd have to set the you could write a short story that was set in the environment of one of those genres. I think of the original Ender's Game short story that was the sort of seed for the novel, and that story basically just the time in battle school, where Ender and his squad are engaged in their strategic fights against the other armies. And so there was stuff going on that was much bigger than what was covered in the short story, and there was a lot of character development in that later came in the novel that was not addressed or dealt with at all in the short story, but the universe, the setting was there.
I think that genres that rely more heavily on emotional impact or emotional response, like horror, comedy, and erotica, are a lot more forgiving of length, because you can tell a short joke or you can tell a long joke. You can get that punch of horror in flash fiction, or you can get, and if you write something longer, you can actually have several instances of the horror. So there are a few genres that are defined less by elements in the story and more by emotional response that you're trying to get from the audience. Mm-hmm. And you can do that in different size packages depending on what you're shooting for.
In some ways,
And
I think that shorter pieces are actually better suited to certain kinds of things, certain kinds of emotional effects or the exploration of certain ideas. If you've got a fairly simple idea, I think of the science fiction short story, The Cold Equations. That is that's a story in which the conflict is built around a fairly simple idea that if you have an extra person stowing away aboard a starship, then there's no margin for error, and you have to make a decision about whether you're going to throw that person out the airlock in order to save the entire ship and all of the people who are depending upon it. That's an idea that is very limited and wouldn't really lend itself to a longer story.
And if you're the kind of person, if you're the kind of writer that likes to do really deep character studies, you can't do that in short fiction effectively. So yeah, it's I think that they're definitely, you have to be aware of, does the genre that you're working in, can it work well given the length of the story you're shooting for, and vice versa. Like when I went in for this particular story, I probably bit off a lot more than I could chew in trying to make it a short story, because a short bit of romance is hard to do. I'm not saying it can't be done, but to really have a believable romance, you've got to have some room to work in. Whereas I'm actually, you asked me earlier what I was working on. I'm also working on a short story that is, I think it would work really well as a short story, and I think that it would probably work less well as the concept that I have, it worked less well as a novel. So yeah, I mean, it really, you've got to look at the idea that you have and decide what kind of space that fits in. Because what happens a lot of times is if you have a simple idea and you try and make it into a novel, being thin and boring, and you'll lose people, versus if you've got something that's a huge idea and you try and fit it into a little space, you may end up leaving too much on the cutting room floor. So yeah, definitely a thing to keep in mind.
I think that Einstein's advice here is appropriate. Ideas or things should be as complex as they need to be, but not more so.
Yes. Yeah, I agree.
All right. If anybody else has any more questions for me and Scott, go ahead and pop those into the Q&A sidebar. You can find that on the left side of your screen by moving your mouse cursor over there. You may have to click on the window in order to get it to pop up, and that will allow you to submit a question. While we're waiting to see if we have any more questions from the audience, I have one more question for you, Scott. So, like me, you are a Christian.
Yes.
Like me, I think it's fair to say that you come from more of the liberal to progressive end of the Christian doctrinal spectrum.
Yeah.
To what extent does your faith inform and drive the kinds of stories that you tell?
That is actually a very good question. And I actually had a really good conversation with my wife about this in general last night. My wife is just off camera, by the way. She asked me, what are there kinds of stories you won't write because of your faith, and are there kinds of, so I enjoy fiction that has a spiritual aspect to it. Don't let that myself to those stories, obviously. I think for me, the way my faith informs what I write is less about the stories or the genres or the elements of the story, and more about the craftsmanship. I read a book, the name of it escapes me. It's been a while since I've read it, but it talked about creation, faith, and art. And the gist of it was, if you look at art created 100 years ago, 200 years ago by Christians, it was more about the philosophy of doing your work well enough that it would be pleasing. It was less about the content of your work and more about the quality of your work. So I want people to know me, because the problem I have with a lot of so-called Christian fiction is A, it's not very well done.
Yes.
And B, it tends to be preaching to the choir. So when I write stories that have spiritual elements, like I have a character, Father Ian, who's a Catholic priest, and he's another mystery solver. Those stories explore a lot about his faith, and he's in the place in the very first story of his that I wrote called Fetch, which is available at my podcast and also available, I think, on Smashwords and Amazon. He's at a place with his faith that's kind of stunted, and he looks at his job less about taking care of the spiritual well-being of his flock and more about taking care of the physical well-being. And he has a supernatural experience, and that returns the supernatural aspect of his faith to him, and so he's exploring that. And there's a lot of rich ground there. But that's not the only place that I want to explore. It's a big world, and there's a lot of stuff going on in it. And what I tend to look at is, A, am I writing good stories? Am I doing good work? And B, am I glorifying things that I disagree with? Like, I don't tend to write stories that are really violent. I don't tend to write stories, as a general rule, that have a lot of sexual content. I don't tend to write a lot of negative things, because that's just not part of what my faith is about. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at, and it's a process. Exploring those kinds of questions is important as well. So if you ask me that question in a year, you might get a different answer.
We are all in process. We're all on a journey.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Scott, for coming on to the Raven and the Writing Desk.
You're welcome. I do want to encourage people. I've got a book launch party on Wednesday. That's when the book will come out. And so if you are friends with me on Facebook, just look at I'll be sharing over the next couple of days links to the party. And there'll be lots of fiction that I'll be giving away in addition to some of my own stuff. So there'll be lots of prizes, and we'll have lots of fun. And hopefully I'll sell lots of books.
Where can people find your stuff?
Well, you can go to scottroche.com, and you can find links to pretty much everything there. If you go to facebook.com/scott.roche.author, that's my author page. You can follow me on Twitter at Spiritual Tramp. And the other social media stuff, you can find links to from one of those 3 spots.
Awesome. All right. This has been the Raven and the Writing Desk with Scott Roche. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you. Keep it on the bright side.